Hello, everyone. I'm Holly Lawford-Smith, and I'm here on behalf of the LGB Alliance Australia. And today I'm talking to Sam. Sam is a 31-year-old Australian graphic designer and web developer. She has a long history of social and environmental activism. She's an ex-liberal feminist, now a radical feminist, and she runs XX Rebellion. She's a sex trade survivor, so she's been speaking out critically on all the topics that'll get a person cancelled these days. So thanks so much for being here and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. When did you first start thinking about your gender or experiencing gender dissonance, and what was that like for you?
So, uh, I had a lot of insecurity as a child, um, and I remember being really anxious to try and do femininity properly
Mm.
and feeling like I was always failing. And um, but I really did want to do the woman gender correctly.
Yeah.
I tried really hard. Um, but then the actual dysphoria kicked in around puberty.
Mm-hmm.
So at first it was something that I was quite excited about. But then I got into high school and discovered that I was attracted to girls.
Yep.
So that was all mixed up in it as well. And um, I started feeling really uncomfortable with my body and specifically with my sex characteristics, which I think is really common among girls.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual dysphoria and the wanting to be a man came about later on, when I was about 15 or 16, and it kind of developed in as part of a relationship that I was having with a girl
Okay.
at the time, which was very confusing. And so she also was dysphoric, and but she didn't have that language for it. Neither of us had that language for it, and neither of us knew. We didn't know that trans men were a thing,
Mm-hmm.
because of course this was quite a while ago. This was like um, 2005, 2006. So it was before, long before all of these politics got to where they are now.
Yeah, right.
And we knew about transsexuals, obviously, because you saw male and female transsexuals in movies and on TV and stuff, but it didn't ever occur to us that that had any relationship to our situation.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we weren't part of a community, we weren't in any online spaces where this was something being talked about. So I think there's probably quite a different experience from what a lot of teenage girls
Go through
um,
today.
having today, yeah,
Yeah.
finding themselves immersed in communities that have a whole vocabulary on the subject, and we didn't have that. But we both had this problem of being uncomfortable with our bodies. But then it went a little further with her because she also believed that she was straight
Mm-hmm.
and only attracted to men. And she told me that she saw me as a man and that she was in love with me as a man,
What?
which is yeah, it's a very, very confusing thing.
That's crazy. Did
And
you or had you already presented yourself as having those kinds of feelings, so she was responding to something that she thought you wanted, or do you feel like she was sort of pushing that at you?
I don't know. I feel like it was, we became really intensely involved really quickly. It was very sapphic, but of course, we didn't realize that.
Yeah.
And we were open with each other about having these feelings. And I had said that I had wished that I could be a man. And when I don't feel like she was pushing me or anything. I don't even know what her situation was to this day. I'm not sure whether she was a lesbian or a bisexual girl who was in denial about that, or if she was actually a straight girl playing out some fantasy.
Yeah.
But I was very in love with her, and I liked that she was attracted to me, and I liked that she was attracted to me as a man,
Yeah.
as she said. And so that really encouraged me to um, pursue that. So I started cross dressing and I started binding, and um, we had this very confusing relationship that we thought was gay, and it was, but in the opposite direction.
Wow.
So yeah, it's over a decade later, and I still can't really make sense of what happened there. But that sort of put me on this path, and we still didn't. That relationship went on for a couple of years, and there was no talk about pronouns or anything like that. There was no expectation that anyone else should participate in this role play that we had going on.
So it was private. You thought of yourselves as gay men being in a relationship together, but you didn't refer to yourselves that way with friends or with family or...
Yeah, because I mean, we knew that we weren't men. we knew that that wasn't true. Otherwise, we wouldn't be uncomfortable with our bodies. The whole point of our discomfort was that we weren't men.
Yeah, good.
And we also, it never would have occurred to us for a second that actual gay men would be interested in us in that way.
Yeah.
So it was, I wouldn't call it totally sane, but it was at least a little less irrational than where things are at now.
Yeah, it sounds, I mean, it doesn't sound that irrational in the sense that it just sounds like what couples often do, which is they build a sort of private language and a set of intimate jokes, and they have things they call each other and things that mean things to them. Like, yeah, it sounds like it was very much a private thing, and you had a good grasp on reality outside of the relationship game, right?
Yeah, we did. But it did also, it was also, it made the mental health side of things worse as well. It wasn't a good relationship for either of us because we would both go through these periods of depression.
Yeah.
And that was usually focused on things like intimacy and stuff, and being depressed over not being able to be intimate in the way that we thought that we should be. And now I understand this to be a kind of internalized homophobia.
Because you're having lesbian sex and then wishing to be able to be having straight sex or gay man sex, or what?
So maybe more specifically internalized lesbophobia, because it was almost preferable to be gay men than to be gay women.
How interesting. I mean, yeah, because there's a sense in which I would have thought being a gay man is more stigmatized than being a gay woman, or, you know, puts you, is that fair, like more at risk of violence, at least in Australia in most places. So it's interesting that would feel worse.
Probably, but something that has occurred to me since then is that homosexuality in men is something that is taken seriously. Even if you hate it, it's taken seriously. There's no doubt that it's real.
Yeah.
Whereas sexual attraction between women,
it's dismissed.
Yeah. So it was almost like, and I do feel like my exposure to porn probably played a role in that as well. Like I didn't want to be like, I didn't want the way that I felt about this woman and my attraction to this woman to have any relationship to the porn that I grew up seeing, you know, my father watching and stuff. So, a lot of unpacking to do there that I probably am going to be doing for the rest of my life. But so it wasn't great for my mental health, it wasn't great for my self-perception, and it was definitely not a healthy thing for a same-sex attracted teenage girl to be doing. But that relationship did come to an end eventually, and at that point I still didn't know anything about what transgender was, or hadn't connected the dots on what the transsexuals that I saw on TV might have to do with me. So I just continued on for a while, and then a couple of years later I started going to my local LGBT centre. And then I found out about once a week they would have a transgender night, and I'd never heard of that before, and I looked up transgender online, And the very first bit of information that I came across about trans men was actually a gender critical blog.
Interesting.
It was very, very critical. It was the old Dirty White Boy blog. I don't know whether
I
or not
don't
you
know
remember
that.
that.
No.
Oh, it was brutal. And so I can personally attest, like I had no bias to begin with. I hadn't already decided that I was a trans man. Like there wasn't a bias there. But right from the beginning being told that trans men were just confused women didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't deter me.
Yeah.
So it just made me curious about what trans men were.
Mm-hmm.
So I started going to the transgender night at my local LGBT centre, and I got involved in the community, and I thought that I'd connected the dots and that I must be a trans man.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was a very different time because those were relatively same people.
Mm-hmm.
The discourse wasn't what it is today, and I don't think any of those people would have expected that, lesbians should sleep with trans women or gay men should sleep with trans men or anything. They were quite grounded people who just had issues with their sex characteristics in the way that they were seen.
Were there many trans men in the group, or was it more trans women at that time in that group?
It was a fairly even split, actually.
Okay.
But I did notice that the trans women were usually older.
Okay.
Whereas all the trans men were in my age group or even a bit younger, like teenagers.
And roughly how long ago would this have been? What sort of year are we talking?
This would have been around probably about 2011.
Okay, cool. That's helpful.
Yeah. And so I figured that I must be a trans man, and I spent a couple of years trying to pass as a man,
mm-hmm.
and binding and everything, and I wasn't very successful because I'm really obviously female.
Yeah.
And I also was quite fat as well, and it's very hard to hide your your female figure and stuff like that. Just makes it more pronounced, but also is a way that you fail at femininity as well, I noticed. And then I had to ask the question of whether or not I wanted to medically transition, and I thought about that for a long time. I even asked a doctor about it, who didn't take me very seriously, and now, while I wouldn't advocate being that dismissive, I'm very glad that he wasn't proactive about getting me on that medical pathway. And I did look around online and got as much information as I could about the medical route, and I ultimately decided not to pursue it.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to risk. I didn't like the equipment that I had, but it worked properly.
Yeah.
And I didn't want it to not work properly.
That's good. That's really rational thinking, like rational long-term thinking, right? Which not everyone manages to do when they feel strongly about something like that.
Well, I didn't have any hardcore ideologues in my ears, thank goodness.
Yeah.
That might have really changed things, and I had accurate information, and it wasn't, even my social transition, the people around me dealt with it really well. Like my family were just kind of like, okay. And they were very neutral on the whole thing.
Yeah.
What today I suppose you'd call watchful waiting, they did watchful waiting with me.
Yeah.
Which was the right thing to do. And once I decided I wasn't going to pursue the medical route, I had to think about what I did want to do. And I ended up deciding that I could never be male.
Yeah.
Because I never thought that I could. I knew that I could never be male. And that my only real option, the closest I could get, was medically transitioning and making it so that I could pass as male in my day-to-day life.
Yeah.
And I knew that wasn't, not just that I didn't want to assume the risks involved and I didn't want to be on that medical pathway for the rest of my life, but also I knew that wasn't going to solve my problem.
Yeah. Okay.
I knew that wouldn't make me happy, and I had the sense that it would actually make the depression worse because it made me think about the earlier relationship I'd had with that girl, and how the times when the depression was at its worst were the times when things happened between us that just made it really clear that we were never going to be men.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like pursuing something impossible was a really horrible way to spend my life.
Yeah.
So I decided that probably the best thing for me to do was to just not fixate on it too much.
Yep.
And to just try and live my life. And that's what I have done for quite a long time now.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Can I ask you about you said something that I'm really interested in a little earlier when you said about the coming across the gender critical blog and then just like really not receiving that well. And I think that that's super interesting for us to talk more about, because obviously, you know, we know a lot of gender critical people now, presumably, and we're sort of advocating on this side of a debate that, you know, the gender critical feminists are fighting on, I guess. So do you know, like, why you took that so badly or sort of dismissed that out of hand? Is it that it was kind of insulting, or it didn't take your feelings seriously? Or I guess just, do you have anything to say that could be like instructive for how we're approaching trying to speak to young lesbians about trans identification?
Yeah. Oh, well, let me just clarify. I'm not a lesbian. I'm
Okay.
bisexual.
Okay, sorry.
But I thought I was for a really long time.
Yeah.
When I was younger. And I'm a very biased bisexual, and mostly do not like men, but I do like some. So,
Yeah.
But it was a lesbian's blog that I came across, and so her approach was very, very direct, and it felt dismissive at the time. I think she was right now, but I didn't get that at the time. And she talked about how, you know, all straight women are unhappy with men and unsatisfied in the bedroom, and you know, play acting at being a man isn't going to fix that. And yeah, it felt dismissive, and also I was in love.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was all wrapped up in that, so I
Yeah,
wasn't
okay.
going to listen to that sort of thing anyway. And also it was incongruent with what I saw, because I discovered trans men and the fact that female to male transsexuals were a thing. So when I went on to try and find out more about that, and found out that there were these people, female people who had medically transitioned, I found out about Buck Angel, and was like, okay, the level of commitment there doesn't seem to line up with the way this blogger was talking about it. Like, it's a lot more complicated and a lot more serious than the way that she was speaking about it warranted.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So do you think it would have helped if she had said something like, you know, for a very small proportion of I'm just trying to think of what we might say now, right? And of course the politics have moved on quite a bit, but if there was a sort of a blog that said something like, there's a very small number of people who really experience dysphoria about the sex body, and for them transition can be the right solution, but for a lot of other people there's just, you know, confusion about sexual orientation and lots of internalized homophobia and confusion about what it means to be gender non-conforming, or to be expected to do femininity in a certain way that's not comfortable to you, like, and we just want to be really careful that we're catching the right people, right? So like, we're not transitioning people that don't need to be, and whatever. Do you think there would have been something like that, where if you hadn't been in a relationship and had the love stuff mixed in, you might have been more receptive to it? Or do you just think probably not at that time, because it's still going to feel like it's denying the way you feel?
That's a good question. I might have been a bit more receptive to it if it was a bit more nuanced and not so dismissive, like say. But I also was a teenager and was really angsty, and also was convinced that nobody truly understood me. So, and you know, that's wasn't entirely wrong. I was a mess of a teenager, and my parents certainly didn't understand me. So yeah, I don't know if it would have made much of a difference, but it would have probably made me feel less hostile towards people who were more critical on the subject. And now, because, I mean, it's not even a very long time. We're talking a period of like, in the last 15 years or so, that's not even much time, but the way the conversation has shifted so dramatically in that last 15 years blows my mind. And I really got taken along for a ride over the few years after I decided not to medically transition and decided that I wasn't going to identify as trans, because at the time, trans referred to transsexual.
Yeah.
The only people who were actually trans were people who medically transitioned. The rest of us were just gender benders. We were just a bit weird, whether we were, you know, cross-dressers or gender non-conforming or what. And that was a very, very clear distinction. There was overlap with the community, as in obviously we had things in common with transsexuals and there was kinship there, but we were not the same thing. We knew that we weren't the same thing. And the language reflected that as well. And also the pronoun stuff. There was none of that pronoun stuff. Like, we didn't ask, if someone referred to me as she or her, it was because they could see that I was female, which meant that I wasn't passing as male. So it would upset me that I wasn't passing as male, but I wouldn't be upset at the person because they were just saying what they saw, and it was telling me I wasn't succeeding at what I was trying to do. Now, the solution to that wouldn't be to get them to use different language, because what I wanted was not to control people's language. I wanted to pass as male. And that was kind of the norm back then. The idea of demanding that people call you she or he, despite the evidence of their eyes saying otherwise, was pretty crazy. Like, I didn't know anyone who was doing that. And I think, and I remember actually being really uncomfortable the first time that I encountered that. It was at a trans event of some kind, or a gender weird event. And I remember there was a new person who turned up, and that person kept referring to me as she. And one of the other people there actually stepped in and started correcting him and just saying him every time. And that was the first time I'd ever encountered that, and it made me so uncomfortable.
Interesting.
It was really uncomfortable because I didn't understand why that person was doing it, because he could see that I was female, which meant I wasn't passing as male. So what was the point in making him refer to me as male? Now that's become the norm, which I think is really unhealthy, actually.
Well, it sounds like when you started with this identification, things were still very binary, right? Like, you know, so I guess if trans is being understood as, like, this was just, it's only just gone out of the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act, for example, like defining gender identity in terms of a cross-sex identification. And this shift, I guess, which we're really seeing the consequences of in the last few years, to being like, no, it's this internal sense of what you are, or this like sense of the body, or maybe you express it in some ways, but maybe you don't express it and you just know it. So I guess that shift is the thing that those activists are picking up on, right? Like, no, he feels like a he, so he's a he. Doesn't matter what he looks like, doesn't matter what his sex is. It's a huge shift, right? Just in how gender is being understood. And
I can remember doing a little bit of the I don't feel like a woman stuff. And I think what I meant by that was I didn't feel like I was womaning right. I don't feel like I could woman right. And I couldn't. I wasn't very good at it. And maybe it would have helped if there were some more critical voices around me saying, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to feel like a woman? What does a woman feel like? But it also might not have helped at all.
Did you see much? Like, I wanted to ask you more about this, like what you might have meant by identifying as a man or disidentifying with women. Like, I guess there's a few questions. Like, one is, did you see many examples around you or in popular culture of really gender non-conforming women? You know, did you understand that there was a range of ways that women were, or did it really seem to you like most women are feminine and I'm not doing that right, or I don't like that? Like, so role models, and then like, do you get a sense of whether you were running away from something mainly or running to something mainly? Like, was masculinity appealing or was femininity just really unappealing?
I think it was both. And it wasn't even so much about femininity, because I mean, these days I'm pretty gender conforming. I even wear makeup sometimes.
Right.
Um, I think that so in terms of role models, I did see gender non-conforming women and girls in my age group as well. Um, but there was a real tension for me between wanting to escape femininity and also desperately wanting to fit into it properly.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
it was both things at once. I felt like I didn't, I felt like I was failing at it, and that had a relationship to my self-worth, but also I really wanted to be free from it as well.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that was to do with the environment that I grew up in, where women were sexually objectified a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
I was exposed to porn at a really young age, and I saw what was valued in a woman,
Yeah.
and I hated it.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to be able to be good at it myself. And this ultimately led me into the sex trade. I spent some time in prostitution in my late teens. So it was very, very strange, because I was being hyper feminine in the context of prostitution. And then I was going home and binding and cross dressing
Fuck.
in my private life. Um,
And at a time where you're mainly interested in women sexually, or presumably your work involves mainly men at that time.
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fuck.
And yeah, it was a whole mess, and it made the dysphoria worse, of course, because after I was able to get out of prostitution, I was very fortunate to not spend too long in it, and to be able to get out and mostly stay out,
Yeah.
um, because I had supportive family and community and stuff. But it obviously left me with some more trauma on top of what I already had,
Mm.
and also more gross feelings about my female body
Yeah.
and what it meant. And so that made things even more complicated as well. The dysphoria was really, it's complicated because I don't think dysphoria is one thing. I think it can be a bunch of different things. You
Yeah.
can have people whose dysphoria comes from just like the desperation to be free of sex role stereotypes.
Yep.
And then you can have people who really do have a dysphoria that comes from this big focus on their sex characteristics and wanting to get rid of them.
Yeah.
And I feel like I also had eating disorder history as well, and I later on realized that there were big similarities between the eating disorder drive and also the dysphoria as well. There was a real drive to unsex my body somehow,
Yeah.
whether it be through starving myself until all my secondary sex characteristics are gone, or um, transing, or binding, or whatever. So, and I also know there are plenty of women out there who have those feelings and never come into contact with gender ideology, and those feelings exist outside of it as well. But then when you add in the ideology and it puts them into this other context, that could have gone really, really badly for me. And I feel like it is going really badly for a lot of girls. And I feel like that is part of why you see this massive increase in the number of girls adopting trans identity,
Yeah.
as opposed to boys
Yeah.
as well, because girls are the ones being sexually objectified. Girls are the ones who are developing these mental health issues and trauma responses and the desire to unsex their bodies.
Yeah. Absolutely. I know. It's really shocking to me that there's not more of a conversation about that. Like, no one really denies what's going on in the culture with the huge influence of porn and like the increasing novelty and how women's bodies are objectified and how much sexual harassment there is in the workplace. Like, even none of the lib fems are denying that, right? They're just denying the connection between that and people disidentifying with womanhood. Like, it just
Yeah.
seems nuts. Like, there's clearly something to talk about.
Yeah, there really is. There's so much baggage attached to womanhood as a concept, and most of it's not good.
Yeah.
In a cultural context.
Yeah.
And if you get your ideas about what a woman is for from porn,
Yeah.
then why on earth would you want anything to do with it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So talk us through what it means to desist, because I think we got up to like you've sort of, your friends and family are being pretty cool about it, like they're just going along with it. You've decided not to medicalize. Where do you start kind of not binding anymore, or not like just wearing men's clothes, or how does that go?
So I stopped binding and stopped trying to pass as male once I came to the conclusion that that wasn't going to make me happy, and that it was probably going to make me more miserable, and decided to just focus on other things in my life. And I still had the dysphoria, and I still do today, actually. It's just more manageable now than it was back then.
Yep.
Um, and again, there were no strong reactions to me desisting from any of the community, which I think was a good thing as well.
That's cool. What a nice family.
Yeah, I was really lucky. And
Yeah.
but it was a very slow burn for me. So obviously, because I never medically transitioned, I didn't detransition, and sometimes I'm unsure whether desist is the right word either, because I think it's often used to mean the dysphoria stops, but the dysphoria never stopped. It's just that I stopped asserting a transgender identity.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it was a really slow process, actually, that spanned many years, and it's only in the last 2 years, I'd say, that I actually have started to say, like, I'm a woman.
Yep.
Which was really hard at first, actually. It made me so uncomfortable. But there was this slow process of but it was really complicated, because it happened at the same time that all these politics were ramping up, and the language was just evolving so quickly, and the goalposts were being shifted over and over again. And I can remember I wasn't identifying as a trans man, but I couldn't identify as a woman. I couldn't quite do that, and I mainly just didn't want to focus on it too much. But of course, I was still embedded in this very hard left community, and these politics were really taking root in that part of the left. And I actually found myself unable to keep up with all of the shifting ideas and the language and everything, because I had never thought that I was trans.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, one day, before the word non-binary, there was the word genderqueer. So when I realized I wasn't a trans man, I was like, okay, I'm maybe just genderqueer. I'm a little bit gender weird, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then that turned into non-binary, and I did actually embrace that term, because I thought, well, that's me. Like, I don't feel like I quite fit, anywhere. I don't feel like a woman, but I don't think that I can be a man, or whatever. So this seems right. And that was fine. And then suddenly non-binary became trans. I was very surprised to find this out, and I had a really hard time accepting that that made me trans, because I was like, well, I'm not medically transitioning, and actually I don't even present in an overtly gender non-conforming way or anything. So yeah, and I actually got kicked out of a couple of groups, trans groups, for that as well, for saying, like, oh, look, I just don't think that you're trans unless you medically transition, and I don't think that non-binary is trans.
Yeah, that wouldn't have been well received.
It wasn't. I mean, I now know that's called transmedicalism.
Yeah. And their whole project is expansionist, right? Like the ideology is trying to bring more and more people in to expand the size of the group, right? So of course they want non-binary to be included, and they want it to be just identifications rather than gatekeeping. And
yes, absolutely. And that was when I first started to find myself at odds with the community.
Yeah.
Which was the beginning of the end. But it still took quite a long time, because obviously the community is diverse and varied, and there are fairly rational, grounded, trans-identified people out there. And so I just hung out with the somewhat more sane trans people. And I just kept identifying as non-binary, and then I ran into I got cancelled for the first time, and it was because of Karen White and Jessica Yaniv, and it made me question the self-ID policies. And I was like, but how are we going to stop that from happening? And the communities I was in didn't seem to care at
No,
all.
they wouldn't, or they just deny it happens, right? Like, I remember having that fight with Rachel McKinnon on Twitter many years ago. Just like, he just insisted that it doesn't happen. And I think he'd published a paper where he'd insisted that it doesn't happen, and then we'd written a group of us philosophers had written a response enumerating a bunch of cases where it had, including Karen White and Jessica Yaniv. And then McKinnon had tweeted something like, yeah, well, there's only 3 cases and they happened after I'd written my paper. And it was like, okay, well, it does happen though, doesn't it, mate? Like,
yeah, they're like, it doesn't happen. And then when it's like, but look, it did happen. It's like, okay, but that's just like one isolated incident. And that really rolled me up because, and this is, I got myself cancelled, and I got myself cancelled unapologetically as well, because it fired me up so much that that nobody seemed to care to even have a conversation. It wasn't even just that people didn't agree with me. They didn't have to agree with me, but they weren't even willing to say, okay, it is reasonable to want to at least have a conversation about these risks.
Yep.
And I started to see the sex dynamic. That's what really killed it for me. And once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. I couldn't stop seeing that it was the trans women's interests that were always at the forefront. And there was never ever a way to tell a trans woman that they were wrong or they were being unreasonable, or to say no. There was never a way to do that. While trans men and, AFAB non-binary people, the vagina havers, right? It was always the vagina havers that came second in every regard. And once I started seeing that, I couldn't stop seeing it. And then that was pretty much it. I spent a year or so finding myself increasingly at odds with the community, and then I got cancelled because I said I didn't think self-ID was a good idea. And then I inevitably found my way to the gender critical subreddit and started actually reading what TERFs actually believed, and was like,
which is obscure, right? That is really, I think it's really obscured from view what we actually think. So I don't blame a lot of people who identify as trans for having a caricatured understanding of what our position actually is, because everything in the media misrepresents it, right? Like, there is no good, fair portrayal. I wanted to ask you, how do you think inside trans communities they deal with that fact of the women kind of being quiet and the men taking over? Like, do you think they just think they're woke? So it's like, yes, that looks like a traditional sex dynamic, but actually it's because our trans men would have male privilege, but they know to be quiet and listen to women, like #listen to women. So do you think they have some story to tell, like, about why actually it's women on top in the trans communities, like women, quote unquote, right? Or do you think they just ignore it willfully? Like, what's going on?
It's their warped version of intersectionality, right?
Yeah.
Is that, of course, trans women are at the forefront because they are oppressed on the highest number of axes.
Yeah, good. So they deserve
being women and being trans. And this is how the concept of trans misogyny ended up being invented, right? So every time trans identified female born people within the community would raise these issues, whether or not they're using the language of sexism, what they're talking about is actually sexism, right? They would be cut off in one way or another, and one of those ways is trans misogyny. So trans women, they can't. So trans identified females, in theory, could use their lane as trans people to be able to have a voice on these things, but they can't because trans women have the lane of being uniquely oppressed as trans women by trans misogyny, which is meant to be the intersection of misogyny and transphobia that only they experience, which is kind of funny because I'd argue that the intersection of transphobia and misogyny would affect trans identified females.
Exactly. So I wonder how they get away with that. Like, I can see what you're saying, that because there's this assumption that that's how intersectionality works, you end up with this politics of deference towards trans women, and that's why there's the silencing. But it's like, if you actually think it through, like, who faces misogyny? Females. How is that made worse at the intersection of trans? trans men. So yeah, it's interesting how they've managed to subvert that and get this like politics of difference going in their interests.
And look, to be fair, it is not everyone in the trans community. There are still trans oriented LGBT spaces that I'm in, that I'm quite happy to be in, and they are a totally different world from the galaxy brained, super woke, very gender ideological places. They're a lot more grounded in material reality. They tend to be a lot more vicious, but everyone's fair game. And you can call that stuff out in those places. Like, there are spaces where you have trans women who identify more with women, which is really what should be happening. We should be able to identify with each other's struggles as opposed to identifying as each other. And there are trans women in those spaces who fully acknowledge that there is an issue with some trans women who really will leverage the power that they have in the intersectional circles to just be sexist and to bully trans men. And there are trans men that don't have any problem speaking out against that stuff. So it really isn't the whole community, but unfortunately the loudest part of the community is the worst.
Worst. But that's interesting to know that it's not that there's not a full takeover of that kind of mentality. Like, that's hopeful, at least.
Yeah, I mean, they some of these spaces, they misgender each other for a joke. Like, it's a totally different place, but those are people that nobody wants to hear from, right? Nobody wants to listen to those trans people. And the thing is that those are trans people who really are mostly just living their lives, so they're not going to be super immersed in any of this discourse or anything. They'll still call me a TERF. I'm allowed to be there at least and call me a TERF, and that's all I ask, really.
No, I agree. I mean, I'd be quite... I find it really weird thinking about this topic so much, but being so disconnected from, like, actual trans people. And I'd be perfectly happy to, you know, if there could just be constructive conversations with some moderate to mild insults going on, that'd be fine. It's like, at least being allowed to be in the room and be part of the conversation, like, because we have so much to work through, right? Like, and how to start resolving what I think are these conflicts of interest between, you know, LGB people and some trans activism and women and some trans activism. You got to be in the room, you got to be allowed in the room to start working that through.
Yeah, definitely. And I still, you know, I'm in these spaces, some of these spaces anyway, still, because I still feel kinship with other dysphoric people. And sometimes it can be rough if you're detransitioned or desisted or otherwise disidentified. Because you run into issues on both sides all of the time. Like, people who desisted and detransitioned women can find themselves being tokenized by radical feminists in a way where you know, they're very warm and welcoming and supportive and everything, but unfortunately sometimes that support can disappear in a heartbeat if you stop being the perfect victim of transgender ideology. Like, those complicated situations where people re-transition or you know, I know trans men who are still on testosterone. Some of them have had top surgery, and they are the biggest TERFs you'll ever meet.
Wow.
But they're not going to detransition. They don't want to detransition. And a lot of radfems don't know what to make of that. And so radfem and gender critical space can be really alienating. And obviously trans space can also be quite alienating. But at least in trans space, people understand the concept of dysphoria.
I find that so, like, I'm really sorry to hear that, because I think that radfems, gender critical people, should be completely open to trans men and to hearing about the range of experiences, right? Like, and I have seen that, what you're saying. Like, I've been to women's land, and there have been like detransitioners who still look very male, and there's been resistance, and I just can't get over, like, I just find that so stupid. Like, your feminism makes you for all women, that you don't get to pick and choose what those women look like, how much dysphoria those women feel, like what experiences those women have had. Like, doesn't mean you have to agree with them, right? But you have to be willing to make sure you're having a conversation or figuring out how feminism can kind of accommodate all of their interests, I think. So I found that weird. It's like you can't just be transphobic. Like you can't actually, and what I mean is like excluding all trans people in virtue of being trans. But you can't do that. That actually is transphobia. You have to pick which trans people, and because our whole view is that it's sex is the thing that matters, that's going to mean you're carving the community at the joints of sex. So trans men are in your gang. You can't just be like all trans people are out of the gang. Like I find it really strange.
It goes beyond even just, you know, alienating detransitioners too, because you also you can alienate LGB people as well, because sometimes there is genuine homophobia behind the dislike of trans people.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is an experience you've had, but I have frequently found myself in a position where I feel like, no, I will absolutely stand by the T in the face of homophobia, even if they're saying all the right gender critical things on the surface. When that's motivated by homophobia and a dislike of gender nonconformity, I'm with the T all the way.
Yeah.
Despite my conflicts with the T.
No, that's good. I don't think I've very often categorized it as homophobia, but I've definitely noticed a real hostility among some gender critical women to feminine men. So to like gender non. There was one case on Facebook very recently. People were sharing that old article of that guy in the UK who wears a suit on top but a pencil skirt and high heels on the bottom. Yeah. He doesn't even identify as a woman, right? That's just a guy with a regular family who just wants to wear high heels and a pencil skirt. Like, fucking great. Like, go do you, right? So I feel like we should just be celebrating that and celebrating all sorts of men pushing the bounds on gender. Like, that's consistent with our sort of gender abolitionist project overall. And yet I do see a lot of women being like, oh, that's just like woman face, or that's just creepy, or that's just... And it's like, I mean, wait, that's not the right impulse, I don't think.
I mean, I thought our position was that pencil skirts and high heels weren't innately linked to womanhood.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, I definitely get that criticism. I do also think there is a conversation to be had about the extent to which we celebrate men engaging in femininity, only because women don't benefit from men engaging in femininity. So I don't feel like we have a duty as feminists to blow too many kisses up their butts over it. But it definitely is helpful to men, and it is helpful to gender non-conforming boys and gay boys.
Yeah. Why do you think women don't benefit? Do you just mean like that's part of the project for men's liberation, so it's not exclusively our business? Yeah.
It doesn't do anything for women's liberation from those gendered expectations. So if we can envision a future where men engaging in femininity has been fully normalized and it's totally acceptable, in that future, men will still not be socially punished for not engaging in femininity, while women still will. So their liberation from the blue box doesn't actually do anything to help. They can be liberated from the blue box while we remain stuck in the pink box.
I think that's true, but I can imagine someone pushing back and just saying like, no, because what gender really, like what the gender binary is really like the pink box for you guys and the blue box for you guys. So any transgressing is at least a move to be like, the boxes don't belong to the sexes, right? Like,
well, they don't, but if you put it in the context of the sex dynamic that exists, right, where, you know, if it's the male sex class that has power, then of course if they decide that they want to wear pencil skirts and high heels, they're going to make that happen. Right?
Yeah.
And they will use the power that they do have within patriarchy to accomplish that.
Yeah.
So
good.
I think obviously I support gender nonconformity in men, and I support men being free to present themselves however they want without being at risk of violence, which is usually going to be motivated by homophobia.
Yeah.
And without being discriminated against in employment or housing or anything like that. Fully support that. But I also sometimes do cringe a little bit at how much energy is put into applauding men for putting on a skirt or whatever.
Yeah,
as well,
that's interesting.
In feminist spaces specifically, because it's like I don't feel like it actually really is something that we necessarily have a direct personal stake in as females.
Yeah, you might be right. I guess my reaction is always like, I'm so happy when they do it and they don't claim to be women, that my reaction is just naturally
That's
really
what's motivating
happy.
it, right?
Yeah, it's like that's the right way to do it. Like, please do that more. Like, yay, that guy.
Yeah.
So yeah. But I take your point that it's like that's not our liberation project. I think that's exactly right. But yeah, sometimes
I mean that's rad fem discourse though.
Yeah. No, I just like you see I sometimes like I'll just get on the tram in Melbourne and there'll be like a cool guy just wearing lipstick and like Doc Martens or whatever, and I'll be like, I don't know whether I love you or I'm mad at you, you know? Like are you just being a fun person who's like slightly pushing the norms of appearance for men? If so, amazing. Like, and if are you claiming you're a woman now because you've got a woman gender identity? Then I'm mad at you. So it's like I just don't know how I feel about a person based on their appearance.
The gender identity thing, I can remember approaching, you know, when people approach the point but don't quite make it there.
Yeah.
I can remember doing that a couple of years ago where I had this where I discovered the agender and pangender identities, and was like, how do you tell the difference between having no gender and being all of the genders at once? Which was me approaching the point and realizing that maybe gender identity was nonsense.
Yep. Okay, I've got one more question for you before we finish. This is about speaking out on this topic in particular. So obviously we're doing this interview with a pseudonym, and we've got your video off to try to like protect your safety as much as we can. But do you still have worries about speaking out, like in this interview and in general? And if so, like what are they?
I do. They're not quite the same as they are for a lot of women who have to worry about their safety and about losing their jobs and things like that. I don't have those concerns. I'm self-employed and in charge of my own life, and it would stress me out to be harassed, but I could deal with it. I've been harassed before, and I've been unpopular before, and I can deal with that. For me, it's more about I have my fingers in so many areas of these politics, and it's very complicated. And I feel like I want to be able to have that conversation on my terms and not on someone else's. Like I'm so hostile to people just barging into my inbox to say that they saw me heart react to something problematic. And who will define the terms of the conversation right from the beginning. You know, the first thing everyone wants to know is, do you think trans women are women? And like, I'm not going to have a conversation on those terms. I don't want to have the conversation on those terms because it is set up to fail from the beginning. There are multiple different conversations we should be having, and I can't have those conversations with any nuance if I'm just shouting my opinions and inflammatory things from the rooftops or on social media. And
do people really do that? They just email you out of the blue with aggressive nonsense?
Not me personally, because people, you know, I'm not extremely secretive about my views on some of these things, especially on the subject of the sex trade, because that's obviously another thing that kind of works the same way. I'm not very secretive about it, but I'm very nuanced about it. I try to avoid being inflammatory at all costs, not because I don't want to get found out, but because I don't think it's actually that helpful. And so I can be relatively open with some of my views, but people don't seem to connect the dots. Like, no one's actually accused me of being a TERF or a SWERF or anything like that, because in their minds, a TERF and a SWERF is a horrible, vindictive monster that thinks that sex workers and trans women should all be murdered.
Yeah,
and
right.
that's not consistent with what they know about me as a person, because
Yeah.
I'm not a bad person,
Well, on
right?
that view, there are no turfs or swifts, are there?
Yeah, there's not. And there's definitely no SWERFs, my goodness, that's not a thing.
Yeah.
But if I were to be inflammatory, then I immediately would set off red flags, and people would. I've seen it happen to my friends who haven't been very careful the way that they put things across, and the conversation goes the same way every time, where they just want to know, do you think trans women are women? And it's like, they don't want to know what your actual full thoughts on this are. They don't want to know how you've arrived at those conclusions and what kind of experiences might be informing it. They don't want to have a conversation with you. They just want you to say the magic words, say the thing. And I just don't want to be put in that position, because I don't think that I don't think it would be helpful.
Yeah.
And I would rather try to keep having conversations with people on those more nuanced and respectful terms.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's not really my style to just get on social media and say, I think this and I think that, anymore. It was back when I was very woke, I would do that sort of thing, but I don't really want to operate like that these days. So yeah, I don't have, it would stress me out to be harassed, but it's not fear of harassment that makes me obviously use a pseudonym and everything. It's more that this is a conversation I want to have with the people in my life, and not have them just watch me on YouTube.
Yeah, good.
And then get upset over it.
Yeah, and they do. Like, from experience, anything you have in the public domain is then just, it does become the thing that people hold you to, right? Like, oh, but you said this thing in this one sentence of this article, and it's like, well, yeah, okay, out of like 300 things I wrote in the, whatever.
Yeah, and I still have a lot of trans-identified friends. It's a mixed bag. I have trans-identified friends who are quite gender critical, and some rad femme trans men friends. But I also have some trans-identified friends who are still very much in the ideology, and it would be really hurtful to them if they were to just have, this little snippet of my views dropped on them.
Yeah.
And
out of context.
Whereas conversations with them where they can see how I care about them and respect them are more likely to be productive.
Yeah. Good. Okay, I think we should end it there so we don't go on for too long. Thank you so much for talking to me. It's been super interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.